Funerals are supposed to be sacred, a time for mourning, reflection, and quiet goodbyes. But if you've ever lived in a neighborhood with an HOA, you know peace is a luxury you can't afford. And in this case, peace didn't just get interrupted, it got dragged away in handcuffs. It was a gray, overcast day at the cemetery, the kind of day where even the clouds seemed to grieve. David Monroe stood by his son Ethan's casket, his shoulders heavy with the weight of loss. His youngest son, Jordan, was at his side, clutching his father's arm like it was the only thing keeping him upright. Friends and family gathered around in silence, their heads bowed as the pastor recited a prayer. It was heartbreaking, yes, but also dignified, respectful, exactly what Ethan deserved. And then she arrived. Karen Holloway didn't walk into the funeral. She stormed in like a one-woman SWAT team armed with nothing but entitlement and a clipboard. You could practically hear the imaginary theme music playing in her head as she marched across the grass, her heels sinking into the damp earth with every step. Behind her trailed 2 police officers who looked like they'd been tricked into coming along for this nonsense. David didn't notice her at first. He was too busy holding himself together for Jordan's sake. But Karen wasn't about to let something as trivial as grief stop her from enforcing the rules. She cleared her throat loudly, the kind of throat clearing that demands attention and makes everyone within earshot instantly hate you. "Excuse me," she barked, her voice cutting through the somber air like a chainsaw through butter. The pastor froze mid-sentence, his mouth hanging open in shock. Mourners turned to stare, their faces a mix of confusion and disbelief. David finally looked up, his red-rimmed eyes narrowing as he took in the sight of Karen standing there with her clipboard clutched to her chest like it was some kind of holy relic. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice low but steady, the kind of tone that says, "I really hope you're not about to do what I think you're about to do." Karen didn't flinch. If anything, she seemed emboldened by the attention. "Yes," she said crisply, flipping through the papers on her clipboard like she was preparing to issue a citation. "I'm here on behalf of the Homeowners Association." David blinked at her, clearly struggling to process what he'd just heard. "The HOA?" he repeated slowly, as if saying it out loud might somehow make it make sense. "Yes," Karen said again, as though this were the most obvious thing in the world. "This cemetery falls under HOA jurisdiction, and I'm afraid there's been a violation. Now let me pause here for a moment because I know what you're thinking. What kind of violation could possibly warrant interrupting a funeral? Was someone setting off fireworks? Hosting a barbecue? Driving an ATV over the graves? No. According to Karen, the violation was Jordan, David's grieving teenage son, being disruptive. David stared at her like she'd just sprouted a second head. "Disruptive?" he echoed. Karen nodded solemnly, as if she were delivering bad news about property taxes instead of accusing a kid of, well, existing. "Yes," she said firmly. "Your son has been crying excessively loudly." For a moment, there was silence, complete and total silence, as everyone tried to wrap their heads around what they just heard. Even the wind seemed to stop blowing out of sheer disbelief. David took a deep breath, his jaw tightening as he fought to keep his composure. "You're telling me," he said slowly, enunciating each word like he was explaining something very simple to someone very stupid, "that my son is being disruptive because he's crying at his brother's funeral?" Karen didn't even blink. "Rules are rules," she said with a shrug that could have powered an entire city with smugness. And then, because apparently this situation wasn't ridiculous enough already, she turned to the 2 police officers who'd been standing awkwardly behind her this whole time and said, "Officers, please escort him off the premises." The officers exchanged uneasy glances but didn't move right away, probably because they still had functioning brains and could see how insane this all was. But Karen wasn't having it. She clapped her hands sharply. Yes, clapped her hands, like they were waiters who'd forgotten her drink order, and snapped, "Now!" That's when David stepped forward. "Now let me tell you something about David Monroe. He wasn't just any grieving father. He was also the chief of police. A fact that Karen either didn't know or had conveniently chosen to ignore in her quest for HOA domination. And while David might have been too stunned to react immediately, There was no mistaking the shift in his demeanor as he squared his shoulders and fixed Karen with a look that could have stopped traffic. "You want to arrest my son," he said quietly but firmly, "for crying at his brother's funeral?" Karen crossed her arms over her chest and lifted her chin defiantly. "It's not personal," she said with all the sincerity of someone who absolutely meant it personally. "It's about maintaining community standards." And just like that, because apparently we live in a world where common sense is optional, the officers reluctantly stepped forward and handcuffed Jordan right there at Ethan's gravesite. The kid didn't resist. He just looked at his dad with wide eyes full of confusion and hurt as they led him away toward the waiting squad car. Karen watched it all unfold with an expression of triumph so nauseating it could have made milk curdle on sight. She turned back to David one last time before strutting off into the distance like some kind of self-appointed queen who just conquered another kingdom. "Thank you for your cooperation," she called over her shoulder cheerfully, and then she was gone. The funeral continued after that, or tried to. But let's be honest. How do you recover from that? As David stood by Ethan's grave one last time before leaving to deal with this new nightmare, one thing became painfully clear. Karen Holloway had no idea who she'd just messed with. There you go, maximum drama achieved. To truly understand the absurdity of what just happened, you need to know a little more about the two main players in this saga, David Monroe and Karen Holloway. Because while this might seem like an isolated incident of HOA insanity, trust me, it wasn't. This was just the latest chapter in a long-running feud between two very different kinds of people. Let's start with David. David Monroe wasn't just your average suburban dad. He was a man who'd spent his entire career serving his community as chief of police. He wasn't flashy about it, no dramatic speeches or chest-thumping declarations of justice, but he had a quiet authority that came from years of dealing with everything from petty theft to full-blown emergencies. He believed in rules, sure, but he also believed in common sense, fairness, and, not arresting kids at funerals. David had moved into the neighborhood about 5 years ago with his wife and 2 sons, hoping for the kind of idyllic suburban life you see in real estate brochures. Tree-lined streets, block parties, kids riding bikes without a care in the world. And for a while, it was great. The neighbors were friendly, the schools were good, and the HOA seemed like a harmless formality. Emphasis on seemed. Enter Karen Holloway. Karen wasn't just the president of the HOA. She was the personification of every HOA horror story you've ever heard. Picture someone who treats their clipboard like it's Excalibur and their HOA title like it's a seat on the Supreme Court. That was Karen. She lived for rules about lawn height, mailbox design, acceptable shades of house paint, spoiler, beige or bust. And she enforced those rules with the zeal of someone who'd been personally wronged by every blade of unkempt grass in America. Karen's reign of terror started small. Little fines here and there for things like leaving trash cans out too long or parking too close to the curb. Annoying? Sure, but manageable. Then she started escalating. One neighbor got fined for having unauthorized holiday decorations because their Christmas lights were multicolored instead of white. Another got a warning letter for planting tulips that Karen claimed were too bright and distracting to drivers. By the time she tried to ban basketball hoops because they were unsightly, it was clear Karen wasn't just enforcing rules. She was inventing them. And David? Well, David didn't take kindly to people like Karen. Their first clash happened about a year after David moved in. Jordan had been playing catch with some friends in their front yard when Karen showed up out of nowhere, clipboard in hand, to inform them that unsupervised recreational activities were against HOA policy. Never mind that David was literally sitting on the porch watching them or that no such policy existed in any of the HOA documents. Karen didn't need facts. She had authority. David politely but firmly told her to leave his property. A response that Karen clearly wasn't used to because she stormed off muttering something about disciplinary action. From that day on, it was war. Karen started targeting David's family with increasingly ridiculous fines and warnings. $50 for having their car tires touch the grass while parked in their own driveway. $75 for not trimming their hedges to exactly 3 feet tall. $100 for excessive noise during a backyard barbecue that ended at 8 p.m. sharp. It didn't matter how baseless her claims were. Karen knew most people wouldn't bother fighting back because dealing with HOA bureaucracy is about as fun as getting a root canal. But David wasn't most people. He fought every fine, every warning, every petty little power play Karen threw his way, and he won every single time because, unlike Karen, he actually read the HOA bylaws. He even started helping other neighbors challenge their fines, turning himself into an unofficial anti-Karen advocate. Needless to say, this did not endear him to her. By the time Ethan passed away and the funeral incident happened, Karen had been stewing in her hatred for David for years. She saw him as a threat, not just to her authority but to her entire identity as queen of the neighborhood. So when she saw an opportunity to humiliate him at his most vulnerable moment, she took it without hesitation. But here's where things get interesting. Karen wasn't just power-hungry. She was also sloppy. For all her talk about rules and regulations, she had a habit of bending them when it suited her, or outright ignoring them when she thought no one would notice. Take her own house, for example. While she'd fined half the neighborhood for minor infractions like mismatched shutters or slightly overgrown lawns, Karen's backyard looked like something out of an episode of Hoarders. Rusty patio furniture piled high with junk mail, an above-ground pool half filled with murky water, garden gnomes scattered everywhere like some kind of creepy ceramic army. It was a disaster zone, and technically against HOA regulations, but no one dared call her out on it because they knew she'd retaliate tenfold. Then there were her finances, or lack thereof. Rumor had it that Karen had been dipping into HOA funds to cover personal expenses. Fancy dinners at overpriced restaurants, spa days at luxury resorts, even a new set of tires for her car, which she justified as necessary for official HOA business. Of course, these were just rumors, nothing anyone could prove, but they painted a picture of someone who saw herself as above reproach. And that's what made her so dangerous. Karen genuinely believed she was the law, so when she showed up at Ethan's funeral and had Jordan arrested for crying too loudly, that wasn't just an abuse of power, it was personal. It was Karen's way of saying, "I'm untouchable." But here's what Karen didn't realize. David Monroe wasn't just grieving his son. He was also quietly taking notes, because while most people would have crumbled under the weight of such blatant cruelty, David saw it as an opportunity. A chance to finally take down Karen Holloway once and for all. And if there's one thing you should know about David Monroe, he doesn't lose fights, not against criminals, and definitely not against Karens. Let's talk about the aftermath of that funeral fiasco because, honestly, it's where things really started to spiral. If you thought Karen Holloway was bad before, this is where she cranked the HOA dictator dial up to 11. But first, let's check in on David Monroe and his son Jordan. Jordan, understandably, was shaken. I mean, how many teenagers can say they've been arrested for crying at their brother's funeral? It's not exactly a story you want to share at college admissions interviews. David, on the other hand, had moved past shock and into a state of quiet fury. You know the type, calm on the outside but internally plotting 47 different ways to dismantle someone's entire existence. And that someone? Oh, it was Karen. But before we get to David's revenge strategy, let's rewind a bit and talk about Karen's reasoning, or lack thereof, behind her actions. Karen had always viewed herself as the ultimate authority in the neighborhood. In her mind, the HOA wasn't just a homeowners association. It was her personal fiefdom. She genuinely believed she was protecting the sanctity of their community by enforcing rules no one else cared about or even knew existed. And if those rules didn't exist, well, she'd just make them up. Take her claim that the cemetery fell under HOA jurisdiction. This was classic Karen. She had no actual legal basis for it, none at all, but she said it with enough confidence that people didn't question her. It wasn't until David started digging through public records that he discovered the cemetery wasn't even remotely connected to the HOA. It was owned by the county. Let me repeat that, the county. Karen had as much authority there as a toddler with a toy gavel. But Karen didn't stop there. After the funeral incident, she doubled down on her vendetta against David and his family. She started sending them fines for increasingly ridiculous infractions. $100 for leaving their porch light on past midnight, a light pollution violation. $200 for having a basketball hoop in their driveway, it had been there for years. And my personal favorite, $54, excessively loud laughter during a family barbecue. Yes, you heard that right. Laughter. The thing is, Karen wasn't just targeting David out of spite. She was also trying to send a message to the rest of the neighborhood. She wanted everyone to know that no one, not even the chief of police, was above her rules. And for a while it worked. People were terrified of her. They started trimming their hedges twice as often and whispering in their own backyards just to avoid her wrath. But David wasn't scared, he was annoyed. And if there's one thing you don't do, it's annoy a man who has both legal expertise and access to an entire police department. David started by filing formal complaints against Karen with the HOA board, a board that, unsurprisingly, consisted mostly of Karen's friends and allies. The complaints went nowhere because, of course, they did. But David wasn't discouraged. He knew this was just step one. Step two involved rallying the neighbors who'd also been victims of Karen's nonsense over the years. And let me tell you, there were a lot of them. There was Linda from down the street who'd been fined $75 for having unauthorized garden gnomes in her yard. Apparently 3 gnomes were fine, but 4 was excessive. Then there was Tom, who'd received a cease and desist letter for building a treehouse for his kids because it violated architectural standards. And let's not forget Susan, who'd been threatened with legal action for hosting a garage sale without submitting an official event permit to the HOA. David went door to door collecting stories and evidence, photos of fines, copies of warning letters, even emails from Karen herself where she outright admitted to making up rules on the spot. By the end of it, he had enough material to fill an entire binder labeled Karen versus Humanity. But here's where things got really interesting. As David dug deeper into Karen's activities, he discovered something big, something that went beyond petty fines and power trips. It turned out Karen had been using HOA funds for personal expenses. Remember those rumors about her fancy dinners and spa days? They weren't just rumors. They were receipts. David found financial records showing thousands of dollars in questionable charges. Luxury hotel stays listed as HOA conferences, high-end restaurant bills filed under community outreach, and even a $500 purchase at a designer clothing store labeled as uniform expenses. Uniforms? For what? Was she planning to outfit the neighborhood in matching beige jumpsuits? Armed with this new information, David knew it was time to take things up a notch. He contacted a lawyer. Not just any lawyer, but one who specialized in HOA litigation. Yes, apparently that's a thing. Together, they drafted a formal petition calling for Karen's removal as HOA president due to gross misconduct and abuse of power. The petition needed signatures from at least 75% of the homeowners in order to trigger a special meeting where Karen's leadership could be challenged. At first, some neighbors were hesitant. They didn't want to get on Karen's bad side. But once David showed them the evidence of her financial shenanigans, oh boy, they couldn't sign fast enough. Within 2 weeks, David had more than enough signatures to move forward. The petition was submitted to the HOA board, much to Karen's horror, and a date was set for the special meeting. Karen tried everything she could think of to stop it, claiming procedural errors, accusing David of harassment, even threatening legal action against anyone who dared vote against her. But none of it worked because, for once, the neighborhood had had enough. By now, word had spread beyond their little community. Local news outlets picked up the story after someone leaked details about Karen having Jordan arrested at Ethan's funeral. Gee, wonder who did that. Suddenly, cameras were showing up at HOA meetings and reporters were knocking on doors asking questions like, what kind of person arrests a kid at his brother's funeral? Spoiler alert, not good PR for Karen. And so, with public opinion firmly against her and an angry mob of neighbors ready to vote her out of office, Karen found herself backed into a corner. A corner she'd painted herself into with years of petty tyranny and unchecked ego. But don't worry, the best part is still coming. The day of the special HOA meeting arrived, and let me tell you, it was nothing short of a spectacle. Picture this. The neighborhood clubhouse, usually reserved for bingo nights and potluck dinners, transformed into a battleground. The parking lot was packed, the room was standing room only, and the air was thick with anticipation. It was like a suburban version of the Hunger Games, except instead of fighting for survival, people were fighting for freedom from Karen Holloway's reign of terror. Karen, of course, showed up dressed for war. She walked in wearing a tailored beige pantsuit that screamed, "I'm in charge," and clutching her trusty clipboard like it was a shield. Her face was set in that trademark Karen expression, a mix of indignation and superiority. As she scanned the crowd for signs of dissent, she didn't have to look far. The room was practically buzzing with it. David Monroe arrived shortly after, flanked by his allies, neighbors who'd been victims of Karen's nonsense and were ready to see her dethroned. He wasn't dressed for war. He was dressed like a man who meant business. No suit, no tie, just a simple button-down shirt and jeans that said, "I'm here to get things done." He carried a binder full of evidence under one arm and a quiet confidence that made Karen visibly uncomfortable. The meeting began with Karen trying to assert control. She stood at the front of the room, clipboard raised like she was about to conduct an orchestra. "Before we begin," she announced in her best authoritarian voice, "I'd like to remind everyone that this is an official HOA meeting and all discussions must remain civil and respectful." Translation: "Don't you dare criticize me." David didn't even flinch. He stepped forward, placed his binder on the podium, and looked Karen straight in the eye. "I think we can all agree," he said calmly, "that respect is earned, not demanded." The crowd erupted into murmurs of agreement. Karen's smile faltered for just a moment before she plastered it back on like cheap wallpaper. David wasted no time getting to the point. He opened his binder and began presenting his case against Karen, starting with her financial misconduct. He showed receipts for those so-called HOA conferences at luxury hotels, restaurant bills disguised as community outreach, and even the designer clothing purchase labeled as uniform expenses. The room gasped audibly when he revealed the total amount Karen had spent. Over $15,000 in HOA funds on personal luxuries. Karen tried to interrupt. "Those expenses were necessary for my duties as HOA president." But David wasn't having it. He held up a copy of the HOA bylaws and pointed to the section on financial accountability. "Nowhere in these bylaws does it say you're entitled to use community funds for spa days or steak dinners," he said sharply. The crowd erupted into applause. Karen's face turned redder than a stop sign. But David wasn't done. Next came the evidence of Karen's abuse of power. Emails where she threatened neighbors with fines for non-existent infractions, warning letters filled with made-up rules, and even video footage of her trespassing onto private property to measure lawn heights with a ruler. Yes, you heard that right, a ruler. One by one, David called on neighbors to share their stories. Linda talked about her unauthorized garden gnomes. Tom recounted the treehouse debacle. Susan described how Karen had shut down her garage sale because she didn't submit an event permit that didn't exist. By the time David finished presenting his case, Karen looked like she wanted to crawl under her clipboard and disappear forever. But instead of admitting defeat, she tried one last desperate tactic: playing the victim. "I've dedicated years of my life to this community," she said dramatically, clutching her clipboard like it was a lifeline. "Everything I've done has been for the good of our neighborhood." David didn't even blink. "Arresting my son at his brother's funeral was for the good of our neighborhood?" he asked pointedly. The room fell silent. Karen opened her mouth to respond but quickly closed it again when she realized there was no defense for what she'd done. And then came the vote. The petition had already been signed by more than 75% of homeowners, a number Karen couldn't dispute. But HOA rules required an official vote at the meeting to finalize her removal as president. Ballots were distributed, votes were cast, and within minutes it was clear. Karen Holloway's reign was over. When the results were announced, an overwhelming majority in favor of her removal, the room erupted into cheers. People hugged each other like they just won a war because, in many ways, they had. Karen stood there frozen for a moment before storming out of the clubhouse without another word. Her clipboard clattered to the floor as she left, a fitting end to her reign as Queen Clipboard. As for David, he didn't gloat or celebrate. He simply packed up his binder and shook hands with his neighbors before heading home. For him, this wasn't about revenge, it was about justice. And Jordan, well, let's just say he got more high fives from neighbors than he knew what to do with. In the weeks that followed, life in the neighborhood returned to normal, or as normal as it could be after years under Karen's rule. The new HOA president, a retired teacher named Betty who believed in fairness and common sense, started undoing many of Karen's ridiculous policies. Garden gnomes made their triumphant return. Basketball hoops popped up in driveways. Laughter echoed freely from backyard barbecues without fear of fines. Karen eventually sold her house and moved away. Not because anyone forced her out, but because she couldn't handle living in a neighborhood where people saw her for who she really was. And David? Well, he went back to doing what he did best. Protecting his community, not just from crime but from people like Karen Holloway. Because if there's one thing David Monroe proved that day, it's this: no clipboard is mightier than justice. You'd think that, with Karen Holloway officially dethroned, the story would end there. Justice served, neighborhood saved, everyone lives happily ever after, right? Wrong. Because this is Karen we're talking about. And Karen wasn't going down without a fight, or at least one last tantrum. Let me set the stage for you. After the vote, Karen disappeared for a few days. No one saw her walking her dog. No passive-aggressive notes were taped to mailboxes. And for the first time in years, people could leave their trash cans out overnight without fear of retribution. It was blissful, but it was also suspicious. Karen wasn't the type to go quietly into the night. Everyone knew she was up to something, they just didn't know what. And then it happened. One morning, about a week after the meeting, David Monroe woke up to find a letter taped to his front door. Not in his mailbox, taped to his door. It was written on official-looking stationery with the HOA logo at the top, which Karen had apparently stolen before being removed from office, and signed in her unmistakable loopy handwriting. The letter accused David of orchestrating a neighborhood coup, defaming her good name, and, get this, creating an unsafe environment for community leadership. She demanded an apology, restitution for her emotional distress, and a public acknowledgement that she had been unfairly removed from her position. David read the letter twice just to make sure he wasn't hallucinating. Then he laughed so hard he nearly spilled his coffee. But Karen wasn't done yet. Over the next few days, similar letters started popping up on other neighbors' doors. Anyone who had spoken out against her or voted for her removal got one. Some people were amused. Others were annoyed. A few were genuinely worried because Karen had included vague threats about legal consequences if they didn't comply with her demands. David decided enough was enough. He gathered all the letters, scanned them into a PDF file, because of course he did, and forwarded them to his lawyer with a note that simply said, "Karen's at it again." Meanwhile, Karen escalated her campaign of chaos. She started posting rants on Nextdoor, the digital playground of suburban drama queens everywhere, claiming she was the victim of a smear campaign orchestrated by a small group of disgruntled individuals. She accused David of abusing his position as chief of police to intimidate her, and even implied that some of the votes at the meeting had been fraudulent. Yes, folks, Karen was now claiming election fraud in an HOA vote. Her posts quickly became legendary in the neighborhood. People screenshot them and shared them in group chats with captions like "Karen's Greatest Hits" and "The Clipboard Chronicles." One neighbor even made a meme of Karen holding her clipboard with the caption, "I am the law." But here's where things took a turn from ridiculous to downright absurd. Karen decided to sue. That's right, she filed an actual lawsuit against David Monroe and several other neighbors, accusing them of defamation, emotional distress, and wrongful termination from her position as HOA president. The lawsuit was filled with legal jargon she clearly didn't understand and cited non-existent laws like the Homeowners Association Leadership Protection Act, which sounds like something she made up after binge-watching Law and Order. She even included a demand for $50,000 in damages, because apparently being held accountable for your actions is worth exactly 50 grand. When David got served with the lawsuit, he didn't panic. He didn't even get mad. He just shook his head, called his lawyer again, and said 2 words, "Let's dance." Now, here's the thing about lawsuits. They're expensive, and time-consuming, and stressful. But David wasn't worried because he knew 2 things. 1, Karen didn't have a leg to stand on, and 2, she definitely didn't have the money to sustain a long legal battle. Remember those HOA funds she'd been dipping into? Yeah, those were gone now, and so was her main source of income, Still, David wasn't taking any chances. He filed a countersuit for harassment and abuse of legal process, a move that sent Karen into full meltdown mode. She started showing up at people's houses unannounced, clipboard in hand, naturally, trying to convince them to testify on her behalf. Most people politely declined. Some slammed the door in her face. One guy reportedly told her to take that clipboard and shove it where the sun don't shine. The court date finally arrived about 2 months later, and let me tell you, it was everything you'd hope for and more. Karen showed up dressed like she was auditioning for Judge Judy, complete with a blazer that was 2 sizes too big and a stack of papers she clearly hadn't organized properly. David showed up with his lawyer, a calm, collected woman who looked like she ate people like Karen for breakfast. The judge took one look at Karen's lawsuit and immediately started asking questions she couldn't answer. What specific statements were defamatory? What evidence did she have of emotional distress? How exactly did she calculate $50,000 in damages? Karen stammered through nonsensical explanations while shuffling through her disorganized papers like someone trying to find their car keys in a purse full of junk. David's lawyer didn't even break a sweat. She calmly presented evidence that Karen had been removed from her position legally and fairly according to HOA bylaws. She pointed out that all of Karen's claims were baseless and reminded the court that this entire ordeal began because Karen had Jordan arrested at his brother's funeral, a fact that visibly annoyed the judge. In the end, it wasn't even close. The judge dismissed Karen's lawsuit with prejudice, meaning she couldn't refile it, and ordered her to pay David's legal fees as well as a small fine for wasting everyone's time. Karen left the courtroom looking like someone had just told her Starbucks was out of pumpkin spice lattes indefinitely. David left with a smile on his face. Not because he'd won, although that was satisfying, but because he knew this chapter of neighborhood drama was finally over. Or so he thought. You'd think that after losing her lawsuit, being humiliated in court, and having to pay David Monroe's legal fees, Karen Holloway would finally throw in the towel. But no. Karen wasn't just a sore loser. She was the Michael Jordan of sore losers. She didn't quit. She doubled down. Because if there's one thing Karen couldn't stand, it was the idea of being wrong. And if there's one thing she hated even more, it was David Monroe. So what did Karen do? Well, she didn't have the HOA to hide behind anymore, and her clipboard had officially lost its power, so she resorted to the only weapon she had left: petty sabotage. Started small. One morning, David woke up to find his trash cans tipped over and their contents scattered all over his driveway. At first, he thought it was raccoons, until he noticed that the trash had been strategically placed to block his car. Then there were the mysterious noise complaints filed with the local police department about loud music coming from David's house at 3 a.m., complaints that conveniently coincided with nights when David wasn't even home. And let's not forget the anonymous letters sent to his workplace accusing him of abusing his position and intimidating community members. Spoiler alert, they were written in Karen's unmistakable loopy handwriting. David knew exactly who was behind it all, but he didn't take the bait. He'd dealt with people like Karen before, people who thrived on drama and attention, and he wasn't about to give her the satisfaction of a reaction. Instead, he kept his head down, went about his business, and quietly documented every single thing she did. But Karen wasn't just targeting David. Oh no, she went after anyone who had dared to vote against her at that infamous HOA meeting. Linda from down the street found her garden gnomes mysteriously smashed one morning. Tom's kids came home from school one day to find their beloved treehouse spray-painted with the words HOA rules. A bold move considering Karen no longer had anything to do with the HOA. And Susan? Poor Susan woke up one Saturday to find her garage sale signs ripped down and replaced with handwritten notes that said, "Illegal sale. Do not buy." It was like living in a bad soap opera where the villain refuses to leave town even after their evil plan has been foiled. But here's the thing about Karen. For all her pettiness and persistence, she wasn't exactly subtle. People knew it was her. And while most of them tried to ignore her antics, a few decided they'd had enough. One afternoon, Linda organized a neighborhood meeting, not an official HOA meeting, because no one wanted a repeat of that disaster, but an informal gathering at her house where people could vent about Karen and brainstorm ways to deal with her once and for all. David showed up with his trusty binder, because of course he did. Tom brought snacks, because snacks make everything better. And Susan came armed with a PowerPoint presentation titled Karen's Greatest Hits, a history of petty tyranny. The meeting quickly turned into a therapy session as neighbors shared their stories about Karen's latest shenanigans. There was laughter, there were tears, and there was a unanimous agreement that something needed to be done. That's when David spoke up. "Look," he said, "we can't stop Karen from being Karen. She's going to keep doing what she does because that's who she is. But what we can do is make sure she faces consequences for her actions." The room went quiet as everyone leaned in to hear what David had in mind. "We've already proven we can stand up to her as a community," he continued. "We got her removed from the HOA presidency, we beat her in court, and we've shown that we're not afraid of her threats. Now it's time to take it one step further." David proposed filing a restraining order against Karen, one that would prevent her from harassing or contacting any of the neighbors she'd been targeting. He explained how restraining orders worked, how they could be enforced, and how they would send a clear message that Karen's behavior wouldn't be tolerated anymore. The neighbors were on board immediately. They pooled their resources to hire an attorney, not that David needed one. He probably could have handled it himself, but they figured it wouldn't hurt, gathered evidence of Karen's harassment, and prepared to take their case to court. When Karen found out about the restraining order petition, she predictably lost her mind. She started posting even more rants on Nextdoor, accusing the neighbors of forming a witch hunt against her and claiming she was being unfairly persecuted for simply upholding community standards. She even tried to rally support from other neighborhoods by framing herself as some kind of suburban martyr, but unsurprisingly, no one wanted anything to do with her. The court hearing for the restraining order was scheduled for 2 weeks later, and by then, Karen had managed to alienate pretty much everyone within a 5-mile radius of her house. The courtroom was packed with neighbors ready to testify against her. Not because they wanted revenge, but because they were genuinely fed up. David took the stand first and calmly recounted everything Karen had done since losing her position as HOA president. The trash can incident, the noise complaints, the anonymous letters, all backed up with photos, timestamps, and witness statements. Then came Linda with photos of her smashed garden gnomes, Tom with video footage of someone suspiciously resembling Karen sneaking onto his property, and Susan with screenshots of Karen's unhinged Nextdoor posts. By the time they were done presenting their case, even the judge looked exhausted. Karen tried to defend herself, claiming she was being framed, accusing David of orchestrating a conspiracy against her. But it quickly became clear that no one was buying what she was selling. The judge granted the restraining order without hesitation and warned Karen that any violation would result in immediate legal consequences. And just like that, it was over. Karen didn't say a word as she left the courtroom that day. No dramatic outburst, no clipboard-wielding tantrum, just silence. For once in her life, she seemed to realize that she'd finally pushed things too far. As for David and his neighbors, they went back to their lives knowing they'd done everything they could to protect their community from Karen's chaos. The garden gnomes were replaced. Tom's kids got a new treehouse. Susan held another garage sale, this time without any interference. And while no one expected life in their neighborhood to be perfect, they knew it would at least be peaceful, for now. With the restraining order in place and Karen Holloway finally silenced, life in the neighborhood began to feel normal. And let me tell you, after years of living under the iron clipboard of Karen's rule, normal felt like a luxury. People started leaving their trash cans out overnight without fear of retribution. Kids played basketball in driveways without the threat of fines. Garden gnomes flourished, treehouses thrived, and Susan's garage sales became a regular weekend event. It was like the neighborhood had collectively exhaled for the first time in years. David Monroe, our hero, was finally able to focus on what mattered most. His family. After everything they'd been through, from losing Ethan to dealing with Karen's antics, David and Jordan were starting to heal. They spent more time together, went on fishing trips, and even hosted a neighborhood barbecue that featured what can only be described as legendary ribs. And the best part? No one filed a noise complaint. But let's not pretend Karen disappeared entirely. Oh no. She still lived in the neighborhood, for now. And while she couldn't legally harass anyone anymore, she found other ways to make her presence known. She'd glare at people from her window like a suburban gargoyle, mutter under her breath when she passed neighbors on the street, and occasionally post cryptic messages on Nextdoor about betrayal and the downfall of community values. But without her clipboard or her title as HOA president, Karen was just Karen, and no one cared. One day, about a month after the court hearing, David got a knock on his door. It was Linda from down the street holding a plate of cookies and wearing an expression that said she had news. "You're not going to believe this," she said as she handed him the cookies. "What now?" David asked, already bracing himself for whatever nonsense was about to follow. "She's selling her house," Linda whispered dramatically. David blinked. "Karen?" Linda nodded so enthusiastically that one of the cookies nearly fell off the plate. "The for sale sign went up this morning." David didn't know what to say. Part of him wanted to celebrate, throw another barbecue, maybe even pop open a bottle of champagne, but another part of him felt, well, relief, not just for himself but for everyone in the neighborhood who'd endured years of Karen's tyranny. Over the next few weeks, the for sale sign became a symbol of hope for the entire community. People speculated about where Karen might go next. One popular theory was that she'd move to a retirement community where she could terrorize people with golf cart regulations. Others debated what kind of person would buy her house and whether they'd be warned about its infamous former occupant. When moving day finally arrived, it felt like a national holiday. Neighbors gathered on their lawns pretending to water plants or take out trash just so they could watch Karen load up her U-Haul. She didn't say goodbye to anyone. Not that anyone expected her to, but as she drove away, someone started clapping. Then another person joined in, and another. Before long, the entire street was applauding as Karen's car disappeared into the distance. It wasn't just an ending, it was closure. In the weeks that followed Karen's departure, things only got better. The new HOA president, Betty, bless her heart, was everything Karen wasn't. Kind, reasonable, and genuinely interested in making the neighborhood a better place for everyone. She held monthly meetings where people actually laughed instead of arguing and even organized a community cleanup day that turned into an impromptu block party. As for David, he became something of a local legend. People would stop him on the street to thank him for standing up to Karen or ask for advice on how to handle their own HOA disputes. He always smiled politely and said the same thing, "It wasn't just me, it was all of us." And he was right, because at its core, this story wasn't just about one man taking on one Karen. It was about an entire community coming together to say enough is enough. So what's the moral of this story? Well, if you've ever dealt with an overzealous HOA president or a neighbor who thinks they're God's gift to suburbia, you already know it. Power only works if people let it. When communities stand together, whether it's against unfair rules or petty dictators with clipboards, they can accomplish amazing things. And hey, if nothing else, this story proves one very important point. Never underestimate the power of garden gnomes. Now before you go, I've got one last request. If you enjoyed this story, and let's be honest, how could you not? Make sure to like this video, share it with your friends, especially those dealing with their own neighborhood Karens, and leave a comment below telling me your wildest HOA or neighbor horror story. And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss any future tales of suburban drama and sweet revenge. Thanks for listening, and remember, sometimes justice doesn't come with flashing lights or courtroom speeches. Sometimes it comes with a clipboard hitting the floor and an entire neighborhood clapping as your least favorite neighbor drives away forever.